By the late autumn of 1944, the island of Iwo Jima had ceased to be a mere geological formation of volcanic rock and black sand and had been transformed into a hollowed-out monument to the concept of infinite delay, a subterranean city of death designed by a man who had stared into the industrial heart of the United States and realized that the only way to fight a machine was to become a ghost. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribashi was unlike the samurai-obsessed commanders who had squandered their garrisons in futile banzai charges on Saipan and Guam, for he possessed the terrifying clarity of a pragmatist who had served as a military attaché in Washington, D.C., and understood that the approaching American fleet would bring with it a storm of steel capable of pulverizing anything that existed on the surface of the earth. As he walked through the stifling, sulfur-choked tunnels being carved 30 feet beneath the Motoyama Plateau, the air temperature hovering near 140 degrees Fahrenheit due to the island's geothermal activity, Kuribashi inspected the labor of 20,000 men who had been stripped to their loincloths, their bodies glistening with sweat and coated in the gray grime of volcanic ash, hacking away at the rock not to build a shelter, but to build a weapon. The general strategy was a radical departure from the water's edge doctrine that relied on stopping the enemy on the beach. Instead, he issued a revolutionary set of courageous battle vows that forbade the suicidal bayonet charges of the past and mandated a war of attrition where every soldier was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying, a grim calculus that required the garrison to vanish from sight. Under the supervision of his chief engineer, Major Taniguchi, the Japanese troops utilized the island's own geology against the invaders, discovering that the soft volcanic stone could be mixed with cement to create a concrete of exceptional durability, which they used to reinforce a labyrinth of tunnels that would eventually span 11 miles, connecting underground barracks, command posts, hospitals, and ammunition dumps into a single cohesive organism that could survive the heaviest naval bombardment in history. The engineering was sophisticated and claustrophobic, with tunnels designed with multiple 90-degree turns to baffle the blast waves of enemy explosives, and ventilation shafts drilled vertically to the surface, camouflaged as innocuous rocks or termite mounds, allowing the subterranean army to breathe while the surface was churned into a moonscape by American battleships. Kuribashi knew that the Americans would fire millions of shells, but he calculated that those shells would only rearrange the dirt on top of his head, leaving his fighting strength untouched in the invisible fortress below. He designed the firing positions not as exposed trenches, but as pillboxes with narrow apertures that offered no target to the naked eye, positioned to deliver interlocking bands of grazing fire across the killing zones. And critically, these positions were connected to tunnels to the main network, allowing a Japanese machine gunner to fire until his position was overwhelmed and then simply retreat into the dark, reappear at a different aperture 50 yards away, and engage the enemy from the flank. The psychological toll of the construction was immense, as men collapsed from heat stroke and sulfur gas poisoning, yet the work continued with a fanaticism born of desperation, driven by the knowledge that the American task force gathering at Ulithi was bringing enough firepower to sink the island. Deep within the bowels of Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that anchored the island's southern tip, the defenders carved out a 7-story hive of heavy artillery and observation posts, transforming the mountain into a hollowed-out watchtower that could look down upon every inch of the potential landing beaches. To the American reconnaissance planes flying high overhead, taking thousands of photographs in preparation for the invasion, Iwo Jima appeared quiet, almost deserted, a brown, ugly scab of rock in the Pacific with few visible fortifications, a deception that led intelligence officers to underestimate the defensive strength by a fatal magnitude. They saw the few trenches and dummy positions Kuribashi had left on the surface as bait,
but they could not see the hospital cave capable of holding 400 wounded men, nor could they see the generator rooms, the water cisterns, where the thousands of eyes watching from the dark slits in the cliff faces. As December bled into January of 1945, the digging stopped only for drills, where soldiers practiced running through the dark arteries of their island, memorizing the blind corners and the escape routes, preparing to enact a strategy that would trade space for time and blood for blood. Kuribashi wrote home knowing he would never return, but he took solace in the architectural perfection of his trap, confident that when the Marines finally stepped onto the black sands, they would not be fighting an army they could see, but an island that would open up and swallow them whole, forcing them into a war where their battleships and bombers were rendered impotent by the crushing depth of the earth.
The prelude to the invasion of Iwo Jima was a display of industrial violence that, by all conventional military logic, should have sterilized the island of all biological life, as the United States Navy unleashed the heaviest pre-landing bombardment in the history of warfare against a target area of only 8 square miles. For 3 consecutive days in mid-February 1945, the battleships USS New York, Texas, and Nevada parked offshore and trained their massive 14-inch guns on the slopes of Mount Suribachi and the Motoyama Plateau, firing shells the weight of small cars that slammed into the volcanic rock with earth-shattering concussions, rearranging the topography and shrouding the island in a permanent, acrid gray fog of pulverized stone and cordite. To the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions watching from the railings of the transport ships, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such a cataclysm. They cheered as geysers of dirt erupted into the sky, believing that the softening up had turned the defenders into jelly. But deep beneath their feet, in the cool, dimly lit silence of the tunnel network, General Kuribayashi sat at his desk, listening to the dull, rhythmic thumping of the explosions above, the vibrations shaking dust from the ceiling, but failing to crack the reinforced concrete of his command bunker. He had anticipated this storm, and he had ordered his troops to stay deep, to hold their fire, and to wait for the fleet to cease its thunder, knowing that the Americans would mistake silence for death. On the morning of February 19, known as D-Day, the naval gunfire lifted, and the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, their boots sinking into the loose, terraced black ash that made running impossible, struggling up the slopes like men in a nightmare trying to climb a mountain of coffee grounds. Platoon Sergeant Gunny Miller, a veteran of Saipan, led his squad over the first terrace, his rifle ready, expecting the immediate crack of machine gun fire that usually greeted a landing, but there was only the sound of wind and the surf. The beach was crowded with men and equipment, thousands of targets piling up in the confusion of the soft sand, yet the island remained dormant, a silence that felt heavier and more terrifying than the noise of battle. Then, Kuribayashi sprung the trap. It didn't begin with a single shot, but with a synchronized eruption of the earth itself, as hundreds of camouflaged apertures on the slopes of Suribachi and the quarries to the north opened their shutters simultaneously. The Japanese defenders, who had been waiting patiently by their view slits, unleashed a crossfire so dense it looked like a solid sheet of lead. Miller threw himself flat into the ash as the man next to him simply disintegrated, hit by a 47mm anti-tank round fired from a position that, to the naked eye, appeared to be just another rock. The horror of the situation became instantly clear. The enemy was not on the island, they were in it. Miller watched as a Marine flamethrower team attempted to attack a pillbox on the right flank. They poured fire into the slit, blackening the concrete, but as soon as they moved on, the same gun opened fire again, cutting them down from behind. The Japanese gunners had simply retreated into the tunnel when the flame came, waited for it to burn out, and then reoccupied the position, using the honeycombs to move faster underground than the Marines could move on the surface. The support weapons arrived, Sherman tanks and 37mm guns, and began blasting the visible fortifications, their high-explosive shells smashing the concrete bunkers, but the effect was maddeningly temporary.
A tank would blow a hole in a cave entrance, collapsing the rock, but the Japanese would simply clear the debris from the inside or shift to a secondary firing port 50 feet away. The massive naval guns offshore, capable of sinking battleships, found themselves impotent against the geology. A 16-inch shell could blast a crater 40 feet deep, but it could not turn a corner in a tunnel, and the shock waves were absorbed by the porous volcanic rock that acted like a natural shock absorber. Miller and his men were fighting a phantom enemy who popped up from spider holes to drop a grenade and then vanished back into the earth before a rifle could be raised. The maps issued to the officers were useless, mere two-dimensional drawings of a three-dimensional battlefield where the verticality of the caves mattered more than the horizontal terrain. As night fell on the first day, with thousands of marine casualties littering the black sand, the grim realization settled over the command posts. The technology of high explosives, designed to shatter steel and flesh, was failing against the primitive durability of the cave. They were throwing steel against a mountain, and the mountain was shooting back. The Americans realized that they could not shell the Japanese out, nor could they starve them out. They would have to go in and dig them out, one cave at a time, in a form of warfare that had devolved from the industrial age back to the Stone Age, requiring a brutality that standard infantry tactics could not provide.
The stalemate on Iwo Jima forced the American military to confront a horrifying geometric truth. In a war of tunnels and right angles, a bullet that travels in a straight line is structurally obsolete. The Japanese had defeated the trajectory of the rifle and the cannon by simply turning a corner in the dark, necessitating a weapon that could ignore the laws of ballistics and behave like a living thing, a weapon that could flow around obstacles, expand to fill a volume, and hunt the enemy into the deepest recesses of the earth. The solution arrived in the form of a gelatinous brownish sludge known as napalm, a chemical concoction of gasoline thickened with aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate, developed by chemists at Harvard who had inadvertently created the most terrifying substance in the history of infantry warfare. Unlike raw gasoline, which burned up quickly and ran off surfaces, napalm was sticky, tenacious, and burned with a slow, agonizing intensity at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not merely fire, it was liquid fire, capable of adhering to skin, uniforms, and rock walls, splashing like water but burning like a furnace. However, the delivery system for this chemical nightmare, the man-portable M2 flamethrower, was fatally flawed for the scale of the Iwo Jima tunnel network. The M2 operator had to stand exposed within 20 yards of a cave mouth to fire, carrying a heavy tank that made him a prime target for Japanese snipers, and his fuel supply lasted only 7 seconds, barely enough to clear a single spider hole. To flush out an 11-mile city of tunnels, the Marines needed a dragon, not a man with a lighter. Enter the chemical warfare service and the ingenuity of the forward repair depots, where engineers began to modify the workhorse of the American armored divisions, the M4A3 Sherman tank, into a mechanical monster known to the troops as the Zippo or the Ronson. The conversion involved a radical surgery of the tank's offensive capabilities. The 75mm main gun, designed to punch through German steel, was often removed or fitted with a dummy barrel, and in its place, engineers installed the POA CWS H-1 flamethrower, Pacific Ocean Area's Chemical Warfare Service, a massive nozzle connected to a high-pressure pump system. Inside the hull, the ammunition racks were stripped out to make room for huge reservoirs containing 300 gallons of napalm mix, pressurized by compressed air cylinders. The result was a weapon of industrial-scale incineration. Unlike the infantry flamethrower, which spat a short, bushy puff of fire, the Zippo tank could project a coherent rod of burning liquid over 150 yards, the length of a football field, allowing the tank to sit comfortably out of range of Japanese satchel charges while pumping fire directly into the enemy's throat. The physics of a Zippo attack were uniquely suited to the subterranean battlefield. When the operator squeezed the trigger, the nozzle didn't just shoot fire,
It shot a stream of unlit liquid that ignited as it left the barrel, creating a wet flame that splashed against the cave entrance. Because the fuel was a liquid gel, it didn't stop at the wall. It ricocheted, splashing around corners and coating the interior walls of the tunnel, carrying the fire deep into the dark sanctuary that bullets couldn't reach. But the true horror of the weapon lay in its secondary effect, a phenomenon the chemical officers called asphyxiation via oxygen depletion. The combustion of such a massive volume of napalm within a confined space instantly consumed all the available oxygen in the tunnel system, creating a vacuum that sucked the air out of the lungs of anyone hiding deep inside, even if the flames never touched them. The Japanese defenders, huddled in their bomb-proof bunkers 50 feet underground, would suddenly find their candles flickering out and their chests heaving in panic as the air turned to carbon monoxide. The Zippo didn't just burn the enemy, it suffocated the mountain itself. As the first of these flame-throwing tanks rumbled toward the lines at the meat grinder, their turrets traversing toward the cliff faces, they represented the final escalation of the Pacific War, a shift from the tactical aim of neutralizing the enemy to the total elemental destruction of the environment they inhabited. The invisible fortress of General Kuribayashi was proof against high explosives, but it had a fatal weakness. It needed air to breathe, and the Americans had just brought a machine designed to choke it to death. By the second week of March 1945, the battle for Iwo Jima had devolved into a slow, grinding siege centered around a rocky amphitheater of death known as the Meat Grinder, where the 4th Marine Division was losing men at a rate that threatened to break the unit's cohesion. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in the labyrinthine tunnels of the Hill 382 complex, had effectively stopped the American advance using their shoot-and-scoot tactics, appearing from hidden apertures to cut down a squad of Marines and then vanishing before return fire could be effective. It was here, in the shadow of the Turkey Shoot ridges, that the Americans finally perfected the tactical synthesis that would break the deadlock, a brutal two-step choreography of destruction that became known in the history books as Corkscrew and Blowtorch. This was not a fair fight, nor was it intended to be. It was an industrial extermination protocol designed to bypass the code of Bushido by denying the enemy the opportunity to die fighting. The Blowtorch was the M4A3 Zippo tank, and the Corkscrew was the demolition team of the combat engineers, and together they formed a symbiotic killing machine that methodically erased the subterranean network one entrance at a time. The operation began with a deceptive lull as the riflemen pulled back, clearing the lanes of fire for the massive, clanking bulk of the Zippo tank as it ground its way over the basalt rocks, its turret traversing toward the black maw of a Japanese cave entrance that had been spitting machine gun fire only moments before. Inside the cave, the Japanese gunners braced themselves, expecting a high explosive shell that they could weather in the safety of the rear gallery. But the tank did not fire a shell. Instead, the main gun nozzle emitted a guttural hissing roar, and a coherent rod of orange liquid lashed out across the gap, splashing into the cave mouth with the violence of a fire hose. The blowtorch phase was terrifyingly thorough. The operator swept the stream back and forth, painting the rock walls with sticky, burning gel that flowed like lava, ignoring the geometry of the tunnel. Deep inside, the Japanese soldiers experienced a horror that transcended physical wounding. The initial blast of heat was intense enough to blister skin 50 feet away, but the true killer was the atmospheric pressure drop. As the napalm consumed the oxygen, the air rushed out of the tunnel toward the fire, creating a wind that dragged men toward the entrance even as they tried to flee deeper. The screams of the burning were silenced almost instantly by the vacuum, leaving only the roar of the fire and the dull thud of bodies hitting the floor as they suffocated in the dark. But the fire was only the anesthesia. The surgery was yet to come. While the cave mouth was still smoking, the heat radiating in shimmering waves, the Corkscrew team made their move. A squad of combat engineers,
weighed down with satchel charges containing 20 pounds of high explosive C2 or TNT, sprinted from the cover of the tank toward the blackened entrance. They did not enter the cave, that was suicide, but instead worked at the threshold with the practiced speed of demolition experts. They hurled the charges deep into the throat of the tunnel, or in some cases, placed them carefully against the rock archway of the entrance, setting the fuses for a short delay. "Fire in the hole!" The shout was followed by a sharp, cracking explosion that lacked the cinematic fireball of the movies, but possessed a terrifying geological finality. The blast shattered the rock integrity of the entrance, bringing tons of basalt crashing down to seal the opening, or shifting the earth to cover the vent. In cases where explosives were insufficient, the Seabees brought up armored bulldozers, their massive blades pushing mounds of volcanic ash and dirt over the cave mouth, burying it under a suffocating weight of earth. The result was a silence that was more disturbing than the noise of the battle. There was no surrender, no prisoners, and no bodies to count. The cave had simply ceased to be a fighting position and had become a tomb. The Japanese soldiers trapped inside, behind the wall of collapsed rock, were left in pitch blackness, their air supply cut off, doomed to a slow, agonizing death by carbon monoxide poisoning or dehydration in the tomb they had dug for themselves. The Corkscrew and Blowtorch team didn't pause to reflect on the grim morality of their work. They simply checked their maps, reloaded the napalm tanks, and moved 50 yards to the next aperture to repeat the process. It was a method of warfare that stripped the Japanese defender of his agency. He could not die for the emperor. He could not take an American with him. He could only be extinguished like a pest in a hive. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese in adjacent tunnels was devastating as they listened to the muffled thuds of their comrades being sealed in, knowing that the mechanical dragon was inching closer to their own air vent, bringing with it the liquid fire that would turn their fortress into their grave.
By June 1945, the tactic that had been improvised in the desperation of Iwo Jima had been refined into a standard operating procedure on the blood-soaked ridges of Okinawa, transforming the final battle of the Pacific War into a methodical exercise in subterranean extermination. The Corkscrew and Blowtorch was no longer a frantic reaction to an ambush. It was a cold, administrative process carried out by the 10th Army with the efficiency of a pest control operation. The landscape of southern Okinawa, particularly the escarpments of the Shuri Line, was pockmarked with thousands of black scars where flamethrowers had scorched the earth, and thousands of fresh mounds of dirt where bulldozers had redrawn the map to hide the entrances to the Japanese underworld. Private First Class Stevens, a 19-year-old replacement who had arrived expecting the glorious bayonet charges he had seen in newsreels, found himself instead standing guard over a silent, sealed cave on Hacksaw Ridge, staring at a pile of rocks that marked the grave of perhaps 50 or perhaps 500 enemy soldiers. There was no way to know, and the army had stopped counting. The silence that hung over the ridge was not peaceful. It was heavy and sickening, broken only by the hum of the flies and the occasional hiss of gas escaping from a fissure in the ground, the telltale sign that the sealed tomb was decomposing from the inside. Stevens watched as a combat engineer team packed up their gear, their faces masked with handkerchiefs, not against the dust, but against the smell, a cloying, sweet stench of rotting flesh mixed with sulfur and unburnt napalm that permeated the entire island, a scent that would haunt the nightmares of a generation of Marines long after the guns fell silent. The legacy of the cave war was visible in the statistics that the intelligence officers tallied in their tents. On Iwo Jima, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders who had garrisoned the island, only 216 were captured alive during the battle. The rest were not merely killed in action, they were entombed. The Japanese strategy of digging in, designed to force the Americans to pay a butcher's bill for every inch of ground, had backfired in the most horrific way imaginable. By retreating into the earth to escape the artillery, they had removed themselves from the maneuver warfare that allowed for retreat or surrender.
They had locked themselves in a concrete box, and the Americans, realizing they could not unlock it, simply welded the door shut. The cave networks, masterpieces of engineering with their ventilation shafts and hospitals, had turned into mass graves where the hierarchy of the Imperial Army dissolved in the dark. Years later, when Japanese bone collection teams returned to these islands to excavate the sealed entrances, they found scenes of apocalyptic despair, mummified bodies huddled around unlit lanterns, diaries with final entries scribbled in the dark as the oxygen ran out, and officers who had committed ritual suicide rather than suffocate. The safety of the cave had been a cruel illusion. The earth provided protection from shell fragments, but it offered no defense against the physics of fire and air displacement. The corkscrew and blowtorch tactic also marked a profound psychological shift in the American approach to the war. The frustration of fighting an invisible enemy who refused to surrender had stripped away the last vestiges of chivalry. There was no room for mercy when a dead bunker could shoot you in the back. The tank crews operating the Zippos and the bulldozer operators burying the caves ceased to see the enemy as individual soldiers. They were simply a hostile infestation that had to be burned out to make the island safe. This dehumanization was the inevitable result of the Japanese defensive doctrine. By refusing to fight on the surface, the Japanese forced the Americans to turn the war into an industrial process of earth-moving and incineration. The final image of the campaign is not a flag being raised or a treaty being signed, but the view from a reconnaissance plane flying low over the southern tip of Okinawa. The ground is scarred and broken, devoid of trees, smoke rising from 1,000 vents in the coral. Down below, a lone armored bulldozer pushes a final mountain of dirt over a cave mouth, sealing it forever. The driver doesn't look back. He simply shifts gears and moves to the next hole. The war had ended, not with the clash of swords, but with the roar of an engine burying the past, proving that against a modern industrial power willing to use liquid fire, there is no hole deep enough to hide in. The caves of the Pacific remain there to this day, silent, concrete tombs holding the bones of an empire that thought it could defeat the future by digging into the past.